The night Ivy Callum walked into the 44th floor of Hargrove Capital Management, carrying a box of files and a lukewarm coffee, 3 men in the corner office were already deciding whether she would live past Friday. She didn't know that yet. She knew the coffee was bad, vending machine dark roast that tasted like burnt rubber and regret, and she knew the files in her arms contained 6 months of discrepancies that nobody upstairs wanted her to find. She also knew that when she'd passed Brittany Sloane's desk on the way to the elevator, Brittany had looked at her, then looked at the box, then leaned over to whisper something to Derek Fallon that made them both laugh. Ivy hadn't heard the words. She didn't need to. 28 years old, 5'4", 190 pounds, and the best forensic data analyst that Hargrove Capital had ever accidentally hired. That was Ivy. She'd come in through a contract position 2 years ago, entry level, the kind of role they gave to people they expected to quit within 6 months. Ivy had not quit. Ivy had instead rebuilt their entire internal audit database from scratch, caught a $700,000 error that saved the company from an SEC inquiry, and received a 3% raise that management congratulated themselves for being generous about. The box she was carrying now contained something much worse than a $700,000 error. She set it down on her desk in the back corner of the analytics department, the corner by the supply closet that smelled faintly of printer toner and old carpet, and sat down. The overhead fluorescent above her flickered twice. It had been flickering for 11 months. She'd submitted 3 maintenance requests. Each one had been closed as resolve. She opened her laptop, pulled the first file from the box, and got to work. Outside, 20 feet away through the glass partition, her manager Howard Tillis was on the phone. She could see him pacing. She could see, from the way his free hand was moving, short, chopping gestures, like he was trying to cut something off, that the call was not going well. Howard was a man who believed very sincerely that his job was to manage upward and ignore downward, and he had spent 2 years successfully pretending that Ivy did not exist except when her work made him look good at the quarterly reviews. What Ivy had found in the past 6 days would make him look very, very bad. The numbers didn't lie, they never did. That was what she loved about them, the brutal, democratic honesty of data. 14 months of irregular wire transfers. Shell companies with addresses in Delaware and the Cayman Islands that didn't appear in any regulatory filings. A pattern of liquidation that, if you knew what you were looking at, spelled out something very specific. Someone was using Hargrove Capital's client accounts to launder money. Not sloppily, not carelessly. Whoever had built this structure was good. Patient. They'd buried it inside legitimate portfolio rebalancing activity so cleanly that 3 previous audits had sailed right over it. But they hadn't accounted for Ivy. She was on her 4th hour of cross-referencing transfer codes when the call came down. Howard knocked twice and opened her door in the same motion, which was his way of pretending he'd asked permission. "Tillis," she said, without looking up. "Castellano's people are here. Stellan Castellano." She'd heard the name the way you hear a thunderclap, distant, then suddenly very close. He ran a private equity group out of Chicago that had acquired a 30% stake in Hargrove Capital 14 months ago. 14 months. The same window as the wire transfers. She hadn't connected those 2 facts until this exact moment, and the connection landed in her chest like a stone dropping into still water. "What do they want?" she asked, meeting with the senior analytics team. Howard was already backing toward the door. "Conference room B. 5 minutes. I'm not on the senior analytics team." "You are today." He said it without meeting her eyes, which told her everything she needed to know about why she was being included, and it wasn't because of a sudden appreciation for her contributions. She was the one who'd flagged the discrepancy internally. She was the one with her name on the report. If something went wrong in that meeting, Howard needed someone to hand to the wolves. She closed her laptop, picked up a legal pad, and went. Conference room B had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Michigan Avenue, and on a clear afternoon in late October, The light came through at an angle that turned everything gold. It was a room designed to make people feel powerful. Ivy had been in it exactly twice before, once for her onboarding, once for a presentation she'd given that 3 senior directors had attended while visibly wishing they were somewhere else. There were 4 men already in the room when she arrived. She recognized 2 of them from the company directory: Philip Hargrove, the founder, who was 71, and looked like a man who had spent decades being told he was correct about everything, and Dale Fenwick, the CFO, who wore his suits 1 size too large and had the carefully maintained smile of someone who knew where every body was buried. The other 2 she didn't recognize. One was a lawyer. She could tell by the way he was arranging his documents in parallel lines on the table, precise and deliberate. The other one was standing at the window with his back to the room, hands clasped behind him, looking out over the city. He was tall, dark suit. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from calm. It comes from certainty. The knowledge, so deep it's moved past conscious thought, that the room will wait for you. He turned around when Ivy walked in, and she felt the exact moment his attention landed on her, because it was the kind of attention that had weight. Maxon Vane was 36 years old, though he looked younger in photographs and older in person. Not older in a bad way. Older in the way that some people look when they've compressed a great deal of living into a relatively short amount of time. His eyes were grey, which she hadn't expected. His press photos always seemed to render them darker, and they moved across the room with the systematic efficiency of someone who catalogued everything and forgot nothing. He looked at her for 1 second, 2. Then he looked at Howard, who had appeared in the doorway behind her and was now doing the thing he did when he was nervous, which was to smile approximately twice as much as the situation called for. "This is our analytics department," Howard said, gesturing at Ivy in a way that managed to simultaneously present her and make clear that he was in no way responsible for her. "Ivy Callum. She's been doing some preliminary work on the portfolio review." "Preliminary," Ivy said. Howard's smile tightened. "Sorry. The work isn't preliminary." She pulled out a chair and sat down. "It's complete. I finished the analysis Thursday night." The silence in the room had a specific texture after that. Philip Hargrove was looking at the table. Dale Fenwick's careful smile had gone very, very still. The lawyer stopped arranging his papers. Maxon Vane looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not surprise, more like recalibration. Like he'd walked into a room expecting one thing and found something else entirely. "Monsieur Callum," Dale Fenwick said, in the tone of a man who was about to explain something to someone he considered very stupid. "I think what Howard means is that the analysis is still in the review phase. The analysis is in my laptop," Ivy said. "It has been since Thursday. I flagged it to Howard on Friday morning and requested escalation. I documented that request." She looked at Howard in writing, with a timestamp. She watched Howard's face go through 3 separate emotions in about 2 seconds. Maxon Vane pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. "Show me," he said. "Just that, not a question." Maxon Philip Hargrove started. "Show me what you found," he said again, still looking at Ivy, so she did. It took 40 minutes. She walked him through the transfer patterns, the shell company structure, the timeline overlay. She'd built a visualization in her analytics software. Nothing fancy, just a clear mapping of the money's movement. And she'd brought it up on the conference room screen. She talked through it the way she always talked through data, methodically, without editorial, letting the numbers carry the argument because the numbers were always better at it than she was. When she finished, the room was silent. Maxon Vane had not looked at his phone once during the 40 minutes. He had not interrupted. He had asked 2 questions, both precise, both pointing at exactly the weakest parts of her methodology, which she'd already addressed in the supplemental notes. And when she'd shown him the supplemental notes, something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "Who built the transfer structure?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "The data tells me what and when and how much. Not who. Your analysis suggests someone with access to the portfolio management system and the compliance signing authority. Yes, that's a short list. 6 people, she said, including 2 in this room. Another silence, and longer this time. Dale Fenwick stood up. This woman has gone far outside her. Sit down, Dale, Maxon Vane said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Fenwick sat down. Maxon looked at Ivy for a long moment. Then he looked at his lawyer, who gave one small nod. The compact, economical communication of 2 people who'd worked together long enough to need very few words. Callum, Maxon said, I'm going to need you to come with me. Come with you where? Somewhere we can talk without an audience. He glanced at Philip Hargrove, at Fenwick, at Howard, a sweep that managed to communicate something very specific without a single word being spoken. This meeting is over. She should have said no. She knew that later. She was a contract analyst at a mid-size wealth management firm with a flickering overhead light and 3 unresolved maintenance requests. And the man asking her to leave with him was the primary stakeholder of the company that had acquired her employer and possibly, the person behind everything she'd just laid out on that conference room screen. She picked up her laptop and followed him out. They went to the 46th floor. Hargrove Capital only occupied through 44. The upper floors were leased to various other tenants. The floor Maxon's team had taken for the week was a law firm that was apparently on sabbatical. All clean lines and empty desks, and the kind of quiet that belongs to rooms nobody's been working in. He didn't offer her coffee. She appreciated that. The vending machine stuff would have made the whole thing feel absurd. You know what you found, he said. Not a question. Yes, and you know it implicates Fenwick, and at least 2 others, maybe more. The structure took coordination. It did. He was standing at the window again. The same posture as before, hands loose at his sides, looking out. What you don't know is that I've spent 7 months trying to prove exactly what you just showed me in 40 minutes. Ivy looked at him. Excuse me. My compliance team has been running a parallel investigation since March. They've been working from the outside in. He turned. You worked from the inside out. Your access to the internal transfer architecture gave you the exact angle we couldn't get. The implications arrived in sequence, each one landing a half-second after the last. You didn't know I'd found it, she said. No, your manager buried the flag. I only found out you'd submitted a report because my legal team monitors internal HR escalation logs. A pause. Your manager submitted a request this morning to terminate your contract. The word terminate went through her like cold water. She'd expected it, had known on some level since Howard's face on Friday, but hearing it said out loud with that kind of flat clarity made her realize she hadn't quite believed it until now. He was protecting himself, she said. He was protecting the people he's been protecting for 14 months. Maxon's voice was even. Tillis knew, not everything, but enough. He's been receiving payments routed through a subsidiary of one of those Delaware entities. Ivy was quiet for a moment. How long have you known that? 3 weeks. Then why hasn't he been? Because removing him prematurely would have alerted Fenwick before we had enough to move on the full network. He crossed his arms. We were 3 weeks from having everything we needed. Then you walked into that conference room. She set her laptop on one of the empty desks. Sat down. Processed, so I accelerated your timeline. Significantly, and Fenwick knows I know. Yes, which creates a problem. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with the same expression from earlier, that careful recalibrating attention, like he was revising something. What kind of problem? She asked. The kind where a man who's laundered approximately $43 million over 14 months has now seen your face, your name on a report, and your complete analysis laid out on a conference room screen. He said it without drama, which somehow made it worse. Fenwick has associates. The kind who solve problems in ways that don't involve HR departments. The room felt a little colder than it had a moment ago. You're telling me I'm in danger, she said. I'm telling you that as of about 40 minutes ago, You became the most important witness in a federal investigation, and the people who would prefer that investigation not happen now know exactly who you are." She was quiet for a long time. Outside, Michigan Avenue was doing what Michigan Avenue did in the late afternoon, golden and indifferent, full of people who had no idea that 46 floors above them, a woman they'd never heard of was sitting in an empty law office, recalculating the terms of her life. "What do you need from me?" she finally asked. Something changed in his expression. It was small, just a fraction of a degree of loosening, like a held breath released. "Everything you have, every file, every backup, every notation. And I need you to be somewhere Fenwick's people can't reach you while we finish what we started. Witness protection, not federally, not yet." He paused. "My building, my security team. 3 weeks, maybe 4, until we have enough to hand to the DOJ and the thing becomes too big for anyone to try to bury." She looked at him. "You want me to come stay with you? In a guest suite in a secured residential building with a full security detail and my legal team 1 floor down? Yes, that's insane. It's practical. Those aren't mutually exclusive." For the first time, something almost, not quite, but almost, like a smile crossed his face. "No," he said, "they're not. Her cat, Herschel, who would need to be boarded, her sister in Columbus who would ask too many questions." She thought about the flickering fluorescent above her desk and the 3 maintenance requests and the box of files she'd carried in that morning with a bad cup of coffee. She thought about Howard Tillis submitting a termination request before noon. 3 weeks, she said. Maybe 4. I want access to your full compliance file. If I'm going to be stuck in a guest suite, I'm not sitting there watching television." He studied her. "You want to keep working the case. I want to finish what I started." Another of those fractional pauses that she was beginning to recognize as his version of a longer silence. "All right," he said. She stood up. "I need to go get my cat." The next 3 weeks were not what she'd expected, which was fair, because she wasn't sure what she'd expected. A hotel-like space, she'd thought. Impersonal. The kind of security arrangement you'd find in a corporate thriller. All glass and grey, and the background hum of surveillance equipment. What she got was a high-rise in River North, with a view that made her want to sit in front of it for an unproductive amount of time. A kitchen that was stocked by someone who had clearly been told what she ate and had taken it seriously. And a desk in the corner of the guest suite that was, and this was the part that actually got her, ergonomically correct. The monitor height, the chair, the lighting, all of it set up for someone who spent 12 hours at a stretch, staring at a screen. She asked Maxon about it, the second morning. "I had my assistant set it up," he said. "Based on your workspace specifications from your Hargrove employee file." "My workspace specifications from my—" She stopped. "That's either very thoughtful or slightly alarming, probably both." He handed her a coffee. Real coffee, from the machine in the kitchen that cost more than her car payment. "You have everything you need?" She looked at the desk, looked at him. He was in a dress shirt, no jacket, sleeves rolled to the elbows. She'd learned, in 48 hours, that he worked this way in the morning and suited up for external meetings in the afternoon, a rhythm as consistent as tidal patterns. "I need access to the subsidiary filings for the Cayman entities," she said. "The ones your legal team has. I can cross-reference them against the transfer codes and give you a complete map of the network. I'll have them sent over in an hour. And I need Herschel's food from the bodega on Wabash. The specific brand. He won't eat the other kind." He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone, typed something, put it away. "Done. You just texted someone to go buy cat food?" "Yes, at 7 in the morning. He's already up." A pause. Herschel. It took her a second to realize he meant his security team member, not her cat, and the delayed comprehension made her laugh. Actually laugh out loud, which surprised her because she hadn't done that in what felt like a very long time. Maxon looked at her when she laughed. Not with surprise exactly, with something more careful than that. The recalibrating attention again turned up 1 degree. She went to her desk and got to work. The subsidiary filings took 6 days to map fully. She built the network visualization in layers, entity by entity, connection by connection, until the screen showed what had taken 14 months to construct and would take, she estimated, about 4 hours to dismantle if handed to the right federal prosecutor. On the 6th day, she called Maxon into the suite at 11 at night because she'd found the piece she'd been missing. He came in without a jacket, which she'd learned by then was his version of running. He looked at the screen. He was silent for a long time. "The holding company in Luxembourg," she said, pointing. "It's not in any of the filings because it was set up under a nominee director. But the formation date and the initial capitalization amount match a transfer that went out of the Hargrove accounts in month 2 of the scheme." She pulled up the comparison side by side. "Fenwick didn't build this network. He's been managing it. The original architect is whoever incorporated this entity 14 months and 3 days ago. Before the acquisition closed," he said, "by 72 hours. He stared at the screen. Then he said quietly but with considerable weight, 'That's Douglas Crane.'" She didn't know the name. She could tell from his tone that she didn't need to, that the name was arriving with its own freight, something that had been building for a long time. "He was my CFO at Vane Group," Maxon said, "before I removed him 18 months ago, for financial irregularities that I couldn't at the time fully prove." A pause. "He moved to Hargrove 4 months later. The room was very quiet. He built the entire thing as retaliation," Ivy said, "targeting a company you'd just acquired, using your investment structure as the vehicle, and spending 14 months waiting for an audit that would never come." He looked at her. "Because it should never have come. Fenwick controlled the internal audit schedule. He didn't account for a contract analyst in the corner by the supply closet," she said. Maxon was quiet for a moment, then no, he didn't. She looked at the screen. The full network mapped and documented, every entity and transfer and date and amount, irrefutable and complete. 14 months of careful, patient crime, laid out in lines and nodes and numbers that didn't lie. "You have everything you need," she said. "We have everything we need," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with an expression she'd seen building for 3 weeks. The careful attention, the recalibrations, something accumulating behind those grey eyes that had nothing to do with forensic accounting. "Ivy," he said, just her name. The way he said it meant something she hadn't expected him to say, and the fact that he was saying it without preamble, without the careful managed distance of the past 3 weeks, made her go very still. "I know what you're going to say," she said. "I doubt it. You're going to say something about professional." "I was going to say," he said, "that in my life I have employed 412 people. I have worked with prosecutors, regulators, analysts, attorneys, and 3 separate Nobel laureates." A pause. "I have never met anyone who thinks the way you do." She looked at him. The room was lit only by her screens, everything else dark, and in that light he looked less like the press photo version of himself, controlled, composed, the default expression of power, and more like someone who had been carrying something a long time and had recently decided to put it down. "That's not what I expected you to say," she admitted. "I know, it's also not really a—" she searched for the word. "It's not a declaration, exactly. It's a preface," he said, "to a declaration, if you want one." She thought about everything she'd thought she knew about how her life was arranged. The flickering light, the invisible corner, the 3.5 years of excellent work performed for people who looked through her. She thought about how she'd walked into a conference room 11 days ago with a legal pad and her analysis and absolutely no expectation that anything would be different by the time she walked out. "Maxon," she said. "Yes, the DOJ meeting is Thursday. I know. After Thursday, I no longer have a professional reason to be in your building. I'm aware. I'm going to need a reason that isn't professional." He crossed the room in 3 steps, unhurried. The same particular certainty that had filled every room she'd watched him walk into, and stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the exact grey of his eyes in the screen light. "I'll work on that," he said. On Thursday, the meeting with the DOJ took 4 hours. Ivy presented the network analysis. The lead prosecutor, a woman named Harrington with reading glasses on a chain, and the energy of someone who had been waiting for exactly this for a long time, asked 27 questions. Ivy answered all 27. Maxon sat beside her and said very little, which she'd come to understand was not passivity. It was the particular confidence of a man who knew he'd brought the right person into the room. Douglas Crane was arrested on a Friday morning outside a restaurant in the Gold Coast where he'd been having breakfast. Fenwick followed 2 hours later. Howard Tillis, Howard, who had submitted a termination request for Ivy on the same morning she'd walked into that conference room, was charged as a secondary co-conspirator before noon. The message Maxon sent her that afternoon was 4 words: "It's done." "Thank you," she sent back. Herschel ate the right food. He called her instead of texting back, which she hadn't expected, and when she picked up he was laughing, really laughing, not the controlled near smile she'd catalogued over 3 weeks, but actual, unguarded laughter, and she thought that was possibly the best sound she'd heard in longer than she could easily calculate. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday evening in November, when the light over the city had gone a deep and improbable orange, Maxon Vane took Ivy Callum to dinner at a restaurant on the 32nd floor of a building 3 blocks from his own, where the maitre d' addressed him by name, and the table by the window had been reserved for 7:15, and the menu didn't have prices, which would normally have made Ivy deeply uncomfortable. What made her less uncomfortable was that when she said out loud, "I want to note for the record that menus without prices are a form of financial aggression," he laughed again, unguarded, immediate, like she'd reached right past everything he usually kept in place and gotten to the person underneath. She ordered the halibut. He told her over the first course that he'd spoken with his board about restructuring the internal analytics function at all Vane Group portfolio companies. Dedicated team, independent reporting line, protected access. He described it for 2 minutes and then stopped and looked at her and said, "I'd like you to build it." "Build it from scratch," she said. "I can't think of anyone more qualified." She looked at him across the table. The city behind him, all that gold light going orange, going dark. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a department." She picked up her fork. "Set it down. When did you decide to do this?" "The moment you told me your analysis wasn't preliminary." A pause. "I filed the proposal with my board the following Monday." She stared at him. "That was the second day I knew you. Yes, you can't make a hiring decision based on 40 minutes in a conference room." "I can," he said. "I did." He met her eyes. "Though I'll admit the reasons have become considerably more complicated since then." She picked up her fork again. Outside, the city settled into its evening self, indifferent and enormous and full of people who had never heard of Ivy Callum. That was fine. They'd hear of her eventually. "I'll need full analytical independence," she said. "No management layer between my team and the board. Agreed. And a proper workspace. Ergonomic, well lit." She looked at him steadily. "No flickering overhead lights. I'll have it written into the contract," he said. And the way he said it, like it was the easiest promise in the world to make, like the contract already existed somewhere and she'd always been in it, made her realize that the room she'd been standing in all her life wasn't the corner by the supply closet. It was every room she walked into from here.